Welcome to the Omnigamers Club podcast, the podcast for games on all platforms, including Pondering Your Orb. I am Daniel Winter.
And I'm Mark USA, and we're very excited to welcome a special guest with us today, writer Sean Weeks. Hello, Sean. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, glad to be on here. I'm an entertainment writer and overall journalist who writes about pretty much everything, including board games. So,
Yeah, you and I, Sean, happened to meet completely by chance at PAX Unplugged a couple of years ago in the Unpub. I think we'll play testing a
yeah.
game together. And another fellow ex-archaeologist. I don't know if are you still practicing archaeology? I don't remember.
I still kind of am.
Okay,
right now, I'm currently in the middle of an alternate history book and doing research and kind of digging into a lot of historical text for it. But yeah, I'm an archaeologist by training.
Very cool.
And a classicist beyond that. So, but yeah, we connected over that, and the Unpub Hall was a great place to meet and to just dig into some raw creation and game design, not see all that polished stuff they show on the game room floor. So that was fun.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time there again this last year. Lots of inspirational concepts going in there. Cool. So yeah, why don't you tell us a little bit more about what you've been working on, like some of your writing.
So the write I've been working on has mostly been on my novel, which is upcoming, but I've also been working on game-related. I've been working on a podcast called Roll of Play with Tin Star Games, the writer Steve D. So he's worked on Relics, and he worked on the Warhammer RPG and
Cool.
A number of other stuff. Also, I think Betrayal at House of the Hill, if I remember correctly.
Well.
And what we're talking about with Roll of Play is how games teach and mold the psychology of play more so than mechanisms, right? So we basically we like ludology and we like talking about ludology, but we want to kind of get away from the pistons and gears and more towards the idea of how are games teaching its audience how to play. So, for example, with D&D, it's the first thing we're kind of talking about, is going into the way that D&D actually teaches and sets up its players to view NPCs, to view the hole in the ground, right? The idea of the dungeon that used to be such a central part of D&D, and how we've moved away from that to what we call avatar play, right? And just talking about how players learn from play, right? So less about mechanisms or trying to put it all in an order. And I really got that from when I talked to Cole Worley, and we talked about taxonomy, and he said it's the greediest thing, and it will take all the time you give it. And I thought well, let's talk about the stuff beyond that, right? The evolution part of playing games.
Right. Yeah, I've only recently started getting into game studies. There's various books and blogs out there. I mean, it's a relatively new game field, I guess, but hugely a lot of potential for digging into what games mean beyond just a set of rules, right? And what drives them. Yeah, I remember reading your interview with Cole, and that was particularly fascinating, talking about the taxonomy that goes into game design. I mean, he's particularly interesting in terms of emergent play. They are relatively complex rules, but a lot of rules that aren't immediately apparent come out of a particular combination of mechanics.
Yeah, I likened it, and I got slammed a bit for this, but I likened it to fugues in music. And I feel a great need, as someone who's also studied archaeology, it's interesting how little time games get when talking about society. Even though they're so central to a lot of the things that we do, they're not productive. And so we feel ashamed, embarrassed, or diverted by talking about them, right? But we learn a lot through play, even when we're not actually playing a physical board game, right? Game theory and gamification is all being talked about, but in the loosest, completely detached from the history of humanity and the arts way, right? Of how do we gamify our stats? How do we gamify our finances? How do we gamify our lifestyles, right? So it's nice to move past that, right?
Very cool. Yeah, I mean, I admittedly, I'm pretty new to this more academic framing of games. I don't have the language or framework there to build upon that, but I do like to think that we build onto something a little more approaching games as art, a games critique, rather than just reviewing a product,
well,
right?
That's the best part. Is like we largely don't have that language yet.
Yeah,
like we don't really talk about it. Like Board Game Geek like has these families of like genuses and species, and what Cole likened it to is like Darwin, right? Is he basically said a lot of the genus and family and species and like the Latin names that we get for species of creature, we kind of get by this idea. And I just finished reading Robinson Crusoe for like a novel, so he like goes into categorizing everything, like finding every single rock and everything and like putting it in its drawer to put the world in order. And he said that Darwin like said all of that was just a distraction from figuring out what he like, I love the phrase he used, the machinery of the world, right? That all of this is like hiding the real way, like the things that actually make us tick, right? And in BGG, sometimes it can be distracting about, like, it'll be distracting in this discussion of arguing, is it a co-op? Is it a deck builder? Is Slay the Spire a semi-co-op because it's like you're less interested in other people, or is it not? And like all of that discussion almost is interesting, but it's more...
It's a distraction. Yeah.
Human beings really love to classify things. It's one of the earliest activities that pseudo-intellectuals started to get really hung up on. Really, the start of museums in general was because people wanted to organize their collections of knickknacks and things that they'd collected from safari overseas, or this and that, or plunder from colonization. Right.
Yeah, it's all about antiquity and like Indiana Jones coming out lately. It's very interesting.
So that's sort of like classification and taxonomy is really just like a trying to apply a Dewey Decimal System and thinking that it would be universal to anything under the sun.
And you can especially see it in board games where like you see the spiral of Board Game Geek discussions where it like goes and chases its own tail, trying to figure out when stubble becomes a beard, right? Like trying to find out where people go back is like, well, maybe we've been wasting this whole time. This like, all right, so the answer is we don't know, right?
Is this a 4X? So it doesn't have that much exploitation, but it has the other X's.
Besides, really an exploration game if it's just cards. Doesn't it have to have like new hexes to be exploration? Right.
Board game fans are a breed of their own, and they have their own predilections and tendencies. That's for darn sure.
Anyway, I think we'll have a lot to talk about in terms of learning games and how they can teach themselves, perhaps in emergent ways, with today's game.
Yeah, really, because like it's a huge crossover over everything.
So we're gonna do just like the brass tacks of who put out this game, what the individual people are, what the platforms are in the case of the digital, because we can't get away from talking about the digital roots of this game, which ironically that comes from analog tabletop
it's come
games
full circle
as well. So this is another one of those twisty, interesting episodes where we touch upon a couple of aspects of a game. So once again, that game is Slay the Spire. It is the board game based upon a hit video game which came out from developer Megacrit by lead developers Anthony Giovannetti and Casey Yano, published by Humble Bundle for every platform under the sun that you can think of. And I was surprised to see this. Apparently it came out in 2019 because in a way it seems like it's been with us forever. But of course, it's as popular as ever now, too. So, Daniel, you want to tell us about the board game then?
Yeah, so the board game came out just a couple of months ago from publisher Contention Games. Lead designers Gary Dworetsky, Anthony Giovanardi, and Casey Yano. Those are the designers of the original, I guess. So they're credited as designers on the board game.
Right. So with that mouthful of words, we're going to toss it over to you, Sean, to tell us what you think about how does this game play, what type of game is this to you in a more loose terms. Why is this game of interest to you?
So to start off with, like, the game puts sort of in terms of a dungeon crawl, it is actually a dungeon. This is kind of like the Raid and kind of like Wizardry, which is another game I played, where you build up or build down and you start on the first floor and you end on the 80th, right? And then it's it, right? It's you pick one of 5 characters, or actually I think it's
4?
one of 4.
4, I think, yeah.
Yes. There's one that was unlockable in the original game that is fully available from the start here. Oh, it's not so unfaithful. How dare they? The original Vision. But basically, it's a deck builder that's co-op. Really, only unless card effects tell you otherwise, the co-op part is just distributing damage, more or less, right? But you essentially have, if you remember the original video game, I'm going to try not to reference it too much. Every step on the floor will either be an encounter with a monster, an encounter with an elite monster, a random sort of question mark encounter. I don't know why people are like jousting on the 5th floor of a condominium dungeon, but like apparently that's going on. And then you also have the shops, right? And then there are also some campfires, sort of like Dark Souls resting points along the way. The video game was just a straight plow through, and if your deck didn't work out, then it didn't. Then it just sort of petered out in roguelike fashion. You start over and scrub really quickly. The way this kind of works in the board game is that you have acts, but each act is like one session. So every time you defeat an enemy or like defeat an enemy, go through an encounter and attack an elite enemy and defeat a boss at the end of each act, you'll pick up more cards for your deck, more artifacts, which are like passive abilities, and some potions for one-time use stuff. Now, again, like the biggest part of cooperation here is that you can distribute damage between everybody's enemies. If you've played like Dungeon Degenerates or Dragonfire or other games of that nature, you do have like assigned enemies to each player. But when attacking, you get to kind of like move that around. So that's the one big difference from Slay the Spire, which is kind of nice, is that I can play it with my wife, who's not interested in going through all the pain of learning the original Slay the Spire, right? Like, Slay the Spire, the video game, was very punishing in the sense that it expected you to fail really quickly and then immediately iterate, and then immediately iterate again, and just kind of get faster and faster with each iteration.
Well, speaking of taxonomy, I mean, I've seen plenty of debates over whether the original digital game counts as a roguelike. For a roguelite, really? I guess. And I think it definitely plays in that sandpit. I'm not particularly interested in having the debate over whether it fits the Berlin definition of roguelite or whatever it is. So yeah, I mean, thanks for that description. Do we want to quickly discuss what our sort of history with that original is, like what our background?
Well, in terms of, in my case, it's kind of an insomniac, a tool for an insomniac. Like, and this is like kind of where you run into the thing that has been a discussion recently, is like, is addictive a good description for a game or a desirable quality? Slay the Spire was very much the game I would play when I was having trouble falling asleep, when I was waiting for my soporifics to kick in, right? My melatonin or what have you. And I would just play it and iterate over and over again and not really even care about the results. So for me, I played it almost compulsively rather than like consciously. So I internalized all the stuff about it, but I can't say that like I was enriched in any great way by the experience, if that makes sense. It's that borderline where you can't tell, like, am I enjoying this, or is it just kind of like breathing? It's like an involuntary response.
Yeah, I mean, I've been talking a little bit lately about games being addictive in terms of like Vampire Survivors we talked about recently, and Balatro last episode, and how they just keep you hooked in and just hitting that random number generator over and over again. And I mean, Slay the Spire definitely
so low.
Yeah, there's no money, no microtransactions to see here. So you can absolutely fall into those loops. Just one more run. I was playing this a lot around the time my daughter was born. So, you know, on the 2 a.m. shifts, sitting with her asleep on my chest, and trying to find a game that's relatively light input that wasn't going to wake her up. So that was one of my poisons there. I played quite a bit of it. back then, I of course got to the decision of, I want to try and get all of the Ascension runs, because that like gives you an excuse, gives you a framework to keep plugging away at it, right? There's a sense of progression, and I think I capped out somewhere at like Ascension 3. Ascension, I should explain, being this. I think it's 1 to 20. Each is a sequentially harder version of the game. It adds more bosses, or reduces your gold, or reduces your potions, and
it leads up to that first by like after you beat the game, like the normal difficulty. It leads up to that by unlocking cards, which the board game weirdly imitates, and I'm kind of a little bit like wondering why that's even there. But yeah, you basically, you'll unlock cards at first, and then you unlock a character, and then you start unlocking more runs. And I got like to 15 or something, 15 or so.
Oh wow!
I just checked the stats for myself. I'm at 523.8 hours, and some of that might be just me leaving the app on while I'm doing things. So, you know, I'm not going to say that this is a lot for me, or that I exclusively play this game a lot. Longtime listeners know that I do play a lot of turn-based games in the background while I'm working.
Yeah,
I'm very bad that way. But funny enough, the Ascensions were sort of a new thing to me. I didn't really know that they existed, because I guess I was mostly playing like the setup of the day, whatever it's called,
Daily runs.
Daily challenge. Yeah,
they have that here too. Also, very peculiar to have.
No, I didn't realize that. But like the Ascension option is sort of hidden a little bit in the menu, so it didn't jump out at me until just recently. So I'm discovering there's a whole new world. But this game is super popular. I mean, like I said, it's only been out for, what is that, 5 years or so now, but it seems like it's ingrained in itself so deep in the hobby, and it's sort of held up as like the model of a roguelite, certainly a card-based game now.
Well, it certainly triggered so many emulators or imitators in that space, the digital card game roguelite. Monster Train and Cobalt Core. There you go.
Oh, there's too many.
Yeah, like Cobalt Core. There's what, Steam Heist, or like something has, I think one of the Steam World games has a card-like base system.
Right.
And then there's like, what is it, Daybreakers? Yeah, there are a million of these now, and it's worth mentioning that like Slay the Spire was really a lot of people's first experience with the deck building genre that had been around since 2008. Like, so for a lot of people, this was their only experience with deck builder up to this point.
I wanted to ask you both what your experience with the analog deck building games was. I'll start with myself. I mean, I was pretty much there from the beginning, around the time of Dominion. That is, of course, the first, they say, analog deck building game, the one that started it all, the one that influenced every other game, analog and digital, to come in the genre.
It was StarCraft, the board game, with it had 7 cards, I think so, but it was a deck technically,
right. And then you could say that there are elements of deck building in other games as well, other larger board games. But pretty soon after, there came Thunderstone, and Thunderstone is an explicitly dungeon delving sort of party of enemies, a party of heroes going at one single boss and tackling a bunch of little minor enemies along the way. So I wanted to touch upon that one a little bit, because I played that one certainly, and it doesn't have the sort of like the tiered levels that you hit, that you were mentioning along the way, like this game does, but thematically it seems like the closest analog.
Sort of ramp up in enemy difficulty. Yeah.
Well, I mean, like an extra step beyond that is, I too actually played. Dominion was the second board game I got after Race for the Galaxy, and it was my dad. Two really good picks, and my brother was kind of introducing me. I just had base Dominion, so I soon grew like very tired of it. But that base box is, wow. Looking back on it, it's hard to find the fun in it now on its own. But yeah, so I played Dominion. I too played Thunderstone also when it came out, when it had no mat. They didn't include a board with the game. And I bought into Quest, everything for Quest. I actually gave it to a friend recently. Sorry, I gave Thunderstone Advanced to a friend recently. I still have Quest, and this is actually very close to Quest in the sense that there are rooms, right? Thunderstone Advance has like those light tiers. Like the amount of light will increase the difficulty of the encounter,
Yes.
but it's just really like a card offer. Thunderstone Quest actually has rooms that will change their species like based on the level you're on. But it's just like 3 levels, not in Slay the Spire's case, like in campaign I'd say there's 24, 27 floors.
I don't know what did it first, but I feel like Slay the Spire, that sort of branching map layout for a roguelike game came out at around the same time as to me. I feel like when FTL was really popular.
Yeah.
FTL, like, you just flip the aspect to the side, right? FTL, you're going sideways. Slay the Spire, you're going up, but it's essentially the same.
You. Like in FTL, you're chased by like the fleet coming the other way, right? So if you dally a little bit too long,
you had a sense of pacing into how fast you work through that progression here. Whereas in Slay the Spire, it's just choose a path and it branches off, but you're always inevitably moving forward in one direction.
You can't go back down. It's weird. Like it's like you've got the trots, and you're like, I have to go up. There's a bathroom at the very top, and I have to keep moving forward.
Before we get too off track, I just wanted to say that Thunderstone for me was also my awakening in deck building. I played a little bit of Dominion and very quickly found it to be too much of a puzzle to be solved. But that card river in Thunderstone Advanced was what I played, and having the variety of not knowing exactly what's going to be available. Interestingly, there was a discussion from John Perry on Bluesky recently talking about comparing Slay the Spire style. Dominion style sort of card selection, and I think Ascension was his point of reference.
Yeah.
Also having the sort of the randomized selection of cards, and I found that a fascinating case study and sort of exactly what you're going to get every round versus some randomization versus Slay the Spire being at the far end of the spectrum of, well, you've got 3 cards, you get take it now or you're never going to see it again.
You have 1 river of like random cards, maybe 3. Now, what if you had 6 pools of rivers, tributaries of cards to a mighty river of randomness? Right? And Star Realms has the single line, and I think that it's very good for like snappy play, but having the market automatically like turns into more of an economic game, right? Which Slay the Spire really isn't.
I was my summary from that discussion was I love that middle point where there is a river. You have an idea of what's going to be available for a couple of turns maybe before someone else buys the card or it sort of moves along down the river. So that really sweet spot of sort of middle of the road planning, long term and short term.
I agree.
But I guess we should move on to how Slay the Spire does that differently. It's very much improvised card drafting. Each of those encounters, or oftentimes a lot of those encounters are going to end with you getting one of 3 cards. It'll give you a selection of here's 3 randomized cards from that deck. Importantly, every character having their unique pool of cards that's designed just for that character, and you'll choose one of those cards to add to your deck.
Yeah, sorry, Daniel, but I think we might even want to reel it back even further back to that by clarifying. Right, by clarifying
the Earth was a big molten mass, right?
Of course, the video game, you're always playing as one of those 4 characters that we discussed earlier. But in the analog game, you're playing as... Each player is playing as one of those different characters. And you typically, almost always, pull from your own character-specific deck of cards. There are a few rare exceptions, but you're almost always pulling from your own deck. So you kind of get the cards that were designed for your character. Which is a good thing and a bad thing. You could see it from both ways. So, I kind of wanted to get your guys' perspective on that. Is like, what do you think about like the built-in strategies to each of those characters as opposed to the wide open sky?
I mean, largely I love drafting and improvisation. Like I like, Magic the Gathering. I love doing draft or sealed formats where you're working with an imperfect selection of cards and trying to find a way to make that work. And this definitely leans into that. It does feel like at times each character has, say, 2 to 3 prescribed strategies. Like if you're playing the Ironclad, you're going to go for the get a bunch of strength, hit things hard strategy, or you're going to go for the I've not played that one in a while.
You kind of wound yourself to get
vulnerable.
buffs.
Well, I think actually probably the best one to exemplify like the rigidness of of the paths is probably the silent.
Yes,
Right.
yeah, my
Because,
favorite
like,
personally, but yeah.
I mean, like, yeah, but it's got like 3 major paths. You have the kunai path, which, like, and all of these can supplement each other to a certain degree. It's a matter of like ratio, right? But like you have the kunai path where you have these extra tokens that all work as +1 attacks, and you just kind of have cards that make a lot of them. You have poison, which can pair with like either that or the other one, which is just playing a ton of cards out, right? Which is to just mill through your
Flood the
deck
deck.
as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
Of course, I think this is utterly unfair in the video game where you have a boss who's at the very end who counts your cards, but it's the one most annoying one to hit. The moment I hit it as the silent, I'm like, well, all right, okay, I guess I'll just start a new run. I won't even finish this one. But yeah, so there are very rigid paths they're clearly like very circumscribed paths for each character.
And often, usually, you're going to be choosing one of those and then trying to find as many cards as you can that will fit into that strategy. And your success is largely going to come down to how successfully do you pull that synergy together, right? Like there will be, you might have to improvise a little bit along the way, but especially once you start doing those Ascension runs, there's very little wiggle room for splashing out. Like, personally, I love building a fat deck, right? I like getting as many cards as possible, the most variety, full chaos mode. But this game does not necessarily reward that.
Well, I mean, it's actually interesting because like we also need to talk about like the relics and the potions and those things massively change your priorities. Like if you have the ninja scroll, which does like basically is a free couple of those kunai, those little shuriken things, then like poison becomes far more attractive. And that's kind of the appeal of both the board and the video game, is that some of the combos can get pretty wacky. But that's also like where part of my criticism of like the board game implementation comes from. My key criticism is that the gameplay and the decks and all of the parts about mechanisms are supposed to reward experimentation. But when I'm playing with other people and I don't want to ruin their run, then I am going to experiment less. There are several times where like my best friend and I were playing and we both played a ton of Slay the Spire. And there were several times where we said, well, normally I'd go for that elite and just say, I want to get that one relic that might make this weird idea possible, right? Of like wrapping my deck around and causing damage every time I discard or every time I have to reshuffle. But because I have a friend here who doesn't, like, I suddenly don't want to do that, right? So a lot of those options, you actually see less of them than in the video game where you just kind of flick through and you take less risk, right? Even though so much of the game is about taking on more risk.
Yeah, interestingly, like so this board game is just a lot longer, for one thing. Like getting through a single act is generally seen as like a session of a board game. It could take 90 minutes or more, depending if you're playing with other people. In which time you could have gotten through 3 or 4 sessions of the digital of the entirety of the digital version, right? And so that iteration, that experimentation, just takes a lot longer, especially if you're relatively new to the game and you're just exploring. Oh, what's this card do? What's this card do? It's going to take a lot longer to just see those experiments through, right, and figure out how well those synergies work together.
I was just intrigued by that because I haven't played this game solo. Daniel, you said you did play this game solo. Did you feel like less sort of precious about surviving for the long term, or did you feel more open to experimentation and having your run get cut off abruptly?
Somewhat, because I mean, this game is in theory easier than the digital version. I think they have scaled back the difficulty for the base level without ignoring Ascension and whatnot, to the point that there is a little more flexibility there in splashing out and trying new things. It's not quite going for the punishing roguelite tone of the original digital game. But at the same time, ultimately, success in these decks is still going to come down to knowing finding those synergies. And obviously, the synergies do work slightly differently. There are some key differences in the cards that we'll get to, I think. But if you're going to have a deck that's going to get through to the end, you're going to have to pick and commit to one of those. And knowing what those strategies are in advance is one of the key battles, right? So having played a character 2 or 3 times to know what those 2 or 3 prescribed synergies are.
Well, I mean, like, there's also the fact that in Star Realms, for instance, you have one roulette, right? The roulette of just your deck and then just the offer. In Slay the Spire, you have the roulette of the relics right next to the roulette of your deck and the roulette of, like, the rewards deck. There are more decks in this game than in other games that have a randomized offer.
You got the roulette of the dice roll at the start of each turn now.
Yeah. That's like kind of the thing, is the level of RNG is pretty large. And I have no issue. Actually, the difficulty, I think, is fine. What's nice is, like, one act in this game is half the length of an act in the video game, right?
Yeah.
And I like that, appreciate that, actually. And I like the fact that they crunched. There's less of what I call, like, this JRPG syndrome, like the Japanese RPG syndrome,
Number
where you're
go
doing this. Yeah, number go up, and you're doing the exact same thing.
Yeah, it's power inflation. Yeah.
And there's less of that, and I do appreciate that. Like,
yeah, I mean, so the numbers themselves, for one thing, are just like a scale of magnitude less than the digital version. So you've got, like, you start with 8 or 9 health instead of 80. Most of your cards are going to be doing 1 damage. You've got an attack card. It does 1 damage to an enemy. In the digital game, it was doing 6 damage, or a shield would give you 5 shields versus 1 in the board game. Because I recently played the digital game for the first time in a couple of years, and was immediately shocked by how much maths was in that digital version. Oh, he's got invulnerable, which is a 1.5 times multiplier. But if I do that, it's with +1 strength on each of those attacks, and it's a double attack. So, like, every single calculation and permutation of the cards in hand is a lot of maths.
And it's like, it's just algebra. It's not like Aeon's End, where, for example, like, with discards, you just flip the discard over to be your new deck, so you know the order. Like, there's quite a bit of in the digital game of algebra is fun because it's algebra, right? Like, the effect 1.5 times, right? Oh, if we cut it in half, weakness does minus 25%. It's like, well, this isn't necessarily adding better decision points. It's just modifying. Also, like, something that struck me is that the character focus in the board game is a bit lessened in comparison to the video game, and it made me realize that the enemy characters in Slay the Spire are not very interesting, but I think tolerable is the minion system. Like, where the goblin leader comes out, and then you pull out the string of
summon
minions.
deck and cycle through that. Yeah,
and they all are cycled by type, so it's like saying pick these exact ones, and it's all to have a one that, like, oh, this one does 1 damage but gets a bit stronger every single time. You do +1 every time, and this one does 1 damage to everybody but nothing else. And it's like, in Dragonfire, this is represented by saying this is a card, and every token on this card has these stats. And you have to get to these before you get to the character beneath it.
Interesting.
And that actually, like, is a lot less overhead.
I feel like in this game they made some concessions to verisimilitude, right? Like they're clearly more slavishly following the aesthetics of the video game. Like you got your elites, or you got your minions, and they're tied to their specific enemies, and that seems like sacrosanct. Like the character designs are the same, they're not whatever pixel art, but the character names are the same, the minion names are the same, the minion colors are the same, even though their mechanisms are slightly tweaked. Like, I feel like they went hard on matching the aesthetics of the game, and they were a little bit more flexible on the mechanical side.
Yeah, and it's like the differences between the characters are rather minute. I think it's because, by necessity, they want you to focus on developing your own deck, and the dungeon itself, because each of the decks, I actually think, are, like, pretty well differentiated. In terms of, like, paths to victory, you have about 3 or 4 per character, right? And multiple ways to potentially get on track. The dungeon does not have any, like, specific attacks other than, like, tricks. Right, none of the enemies that you face themselves have any powers or, like, any sort of synergy much between them beyond. I think the one is Shambling Mound is every time you attack it randomizes its attack again. But there is this kind of, like, lack of character to the dungeon itself,
There
Right?
is a lot more predictability, it feels like. And I mean, in ways that make me think about how much the original digital game hid its predictability, especially in
Mhm.
like how the map is generated and how the enemy attack patterns are determined. Like, because we haven't said, the enemy attacks are always telegraphed. Like,
Mhm.
this enemy is going to attack for 3 damage this turn. This enemy is going to generate 5 shield this turn.
Solve for
And
X.
yeah, and this board game, it feels like seeing the Matrix, like, because
Yeah.
you can, like, you see how everything is calculated. Also, that's how they're generating their attack pattern. Oh, first it does this, and it does this, and it does this. Simple, in both fascinating ways, but also makes it feel a little more predictable and deterministic, I guess. Although some enemies do have are determined by that dice roll.
It punishes failure less. Like that's
Mm.
kind of, again, that's another case where my wife's like, I'm glad I can see it and I don't have to do what's in the video game where I fail just to be able to see it.
Pull that RNG lever again. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah,
And that's
yeah.
potentially where you get some more of the interesting choices in a game. You know, I tend to believe a game is interesting if you have to make interesting choices. If you don't make choices, then you're going to be playing Candyland, essentially. And the choices when you're playing cooperatively and you do have a lot of enemies on the map is that we should take out these enemies first because the wallop that we're going to get to this one character who's down on HP is going to be a lot more considerable than that. And you can, have a little conversation amongst yourselves. You can sort of determine where to allocate the damage effectively, who should go first. Like, these are really the only choices you're making in the moment to moment, as opposed to the long term strategy of building out your character. Like, that's what the multiplayer aspect of it lets you do, is you sort of, rather than you're facing that big wallop, you can sort of take one for the team and fall on your sword to help that other character survive a little bit.
Yeah, it's
That's
really
another
nice.
choice.
I like that, but did you actually notice in the rule book it explicitly had a play nice rule for discussion where it said you can't tell somebody to lay the cards out on the table. You have to like ask them, and you have to ask them questions instead of forcing their hand on the table. And I'm like, this rule is there so someone can point to the rule book and say the rules mean you can't
Stop
do this.
quarterbacking.
Yeah, exactly.
What it also means, though, is it just comes down to an exercise in bookkeeping. It's like, well, okay, I've got 15 damage in my hand. How much damage do you have in your hand? Okay, where should we assign? I don't think it's the most interesting way of, like, especially when you've got 4 players, there could be as many as 20 enemies on the board, and it's just a matter of triage and which one do we focus down first. I think that could have been a more interesting way rather than just this literal wall of enemies and picking out the one in the pack that's like the first target.
And I think what Mark said is worth mentioning is like, in terms of interesting decisions, there are dead decisions where people go, oh, I do enough math. I'm going to do enough math next turn. Let's just clean up the enemies and like immediately move to the next one and skip all the turns. Right. You call it. Sometimes you like say, oh, I do enough damage. I can skip actually resolving any of this or the next round.
That's true. That's very true. At some point I realized when I was playing, mostly I played through campaign with my oldest kid, and for one, they were being very diligent about saying, I'm playing this card and leveraging this effect and this sort of thing, and I was just tuning it out. It's like, dude, just tell me how much damage you deal. I can't track your stuff and my stuff, so
I got my own shit to worry about.
I feel like quarterbacking is no problem at all.
Yeah, well, I mean, you ultimately come down to this point where the boss has 25 health left, and you all look at your cards like, okay, do we have 25 health damage between us? Okay, we beat him. Okay, let's move on.
Yeah,
there's no fanfare.
I remember what I was going to say is the last round, almost the last round of every encounter, you just skip it all because it's like, we do enough damage.
Extremely anticlimactic, yeah.
Yeah, well, I get that feeling when like when I was playing, I think Bridge or like Hearts, either one or the other with my dad, and he just laid down his hands and said, "All right, I just take all the cards, everybody like tossing their hands, let's do it, go again." I'm like, what happened? What just happened? I got hit by a car, right? Like, there is, I feel like those pain points existed in the video game, and I feel like in some sense this shows how I don't feel like the original design of Slay the Spire is as strong as people kind of make it out to be. If I may be like a little heretical, I think that when you say interesting decisions, there are lots of those dead turns.
Those interesting decisions are very few of those are in the encounters themselves, right?
Well, like think about those little roach things, like that they get one hit and then they curl up into a ball and then they get 2 armor, right? And then
Yeah.
you know there's like, all right, okay, I'll block them and then I have to hit them and kill them next turn, and it's procedural to the point where like my friend and I said one of the things that we did compliment about the game is that we said this isn't very co-op in the first act, and then in the second, third, and I think we didn't go for the fourth, but because the whole key thing. But the second and third, like we were saying, oh, we actually have to cooperate more. But then that made us think, like, there's a quick start guide for skipping the first act. Almost, why wouldn't a turn 0 be fine, and then you just get on to the more interesting parts? There's a lot of like business in Slay the Spire.
It takes a long time for those decks to become more interesting, both in your individual deck being less interesting and also the opportunities to interact being pretty few and far between at the start of the game.
Yeah, and like I think that kind of all of those things I would criticize even if Slay the Spire, the video game, did not exist, and I don't actually think Slay the Spire is a better game. For me, they come out about even. But if they turned the board game into a video game, I would say that the board game is better. Because again, like reducing all those numbers and like basically taking all that rot out, like makes it a more interesting experience, strangely enough.
The digital game does become incredibly unwieldy. It leverages the digital format for some really interesting ways in ways that aren't possible in the physical play space, like randomization, like drawing a random card out of all the potential cards and to give you 2, or tracking upgrades. Like there are some cards that will, like every time you play it, it will upgrade and stay permanently upgraded. Things you can't do in a physical game, similar to Hearthstone.
Well, doesn't it do it here with like the cards that flip though?
You can upgrade them, but like it's just 2 levels. Like there's the basic version and the upgraded version.
Oh, right, you can't like upgrade 5 times.
Yeah,
and then there are the ones that say like use this every 6th combat. This happens, right?
But even with all that, it becomes incredibly hard to keep track of. Once you have 15 relics and like, okay, well, every 6th turn I get a bonus energy, and every 3 turns I get some thorns, and like balancing all of those synergies each round. At some point, you just turn to autopilot and say, okay, I've got the numbers. Okay, click, 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 click. It's easy to misclick and sort of not be paying attention to every little detail to optimize. At least for me, I just glaze over at the thought of trying to play this game optimally.
Well, like Mark, you did it with your older kid. Did he feel like he was in algebra class at all?
No, I think that they enjoyed it a lot, and it was pretty smooth because the numbers were so low. And the procedures are just pretty straightforward math. I don't think it was hard at all for anyone who likes turn-based games. And they enjoy like role-playing games as well. So just the basic arithmetic of it isn't too hard.
It's not like the question of difficulty. It's just like the solve for X nature of it. Like one of the things I really like about board game mechanisms is the idea of like stuff that is more representational, like less about the math that you can do and more, because one of the things I hate about Civilization, I think everybody gets bored around the time that they discover like coal or like get past gunpowder, because like all the little numbers just take over the screen and fire axes. Micromanagement for everything, and then you realize that sugar doesn't feel like sugar anymore. It's just a +6 to my trade deficit or whatever. It's like there's a point where the representation falls away and then the math is just left there, right?
Yeah, I don't know. I think with games, like there's a balance of things, right? Like I think the video game is more appealing to some. I wouldn't say to myself, but to some, I think they like these big numbers exploding and multiplying, and the AI, the computer, will hold your hand and do all the calculation for you. You just see the big wallop go against the bad guy. And it's the extreme that some games in the genre, like I don't know if either of you guys have played Monster Train.
Yes.
Go to. I actually really like Monster Train, but it is not a precise design. It's sort of like setting up a Rube Goldberg machine.
Yeah.
Right? You put the pieces in place, and then you press play, and they go ding 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 ding, and then the ball hits this, and it whacks against that, and you just see the scroll of large numbers go by. And there's just something exciting about seeing your mechanism, the machine that you made, just run.
Well, part of the my original point there was how the digital version is so many systems laid on top of each other. Is it feels like it's designed to break the game. Like, it's not worried about balance between players. It's like you're finding ways to get that poison meter to 99, or get your strength level to doing plus 50 damage for every attack. Whereas the board game, it's not just scaling back the numbers and the maths being more manageable. It's also capping out certain things. Like, you can only have max 8 strength or max
30 poison, right?
Yeah. And so it's just, I wouldn't say it's just more balanced, but it's just bringing everything down to earth, and it's not about breaking the game. It's about enjoying the journey more than the destination of getting that broken deck.
but I still actually think that all those things are there. Like, quite largely, like, you still want to cap out at like 30 poison or whatever. And there is kind of that push to, because of all these different streams of luck and like power-ups and multipliers, there is this MMORPG of like making the numbers go up. But again, there's that thing of like, well, I'm less likely to attack that elite because if I don't survive and it's on my own time, I only have myself to blame. But like, I don't want the table to blame me because I strong-armed them. So like, I feel like that's the part where the game for me becomes like an issue, right? Is that it essentially has said, we take the same mechanisms and we move them into a communal context. And one of the things I want people to think the most about with these types of translations is what is perceiving each other adding to the way we play the game. Like in Frostpunk, for instance, which I wrote about this effect. The video game is a solitary experience. And then I'm in solitary and I'm like, child labor? Sure, right? Like, no one sees this. But if I say that to a table of like 3 people, we're all kind of going like, like, our hands are a little bloody and we're watching other people also do it. And we're thinking, are you a scumbag? But I am too. Like,
none of us would possibly do that, right? Right, guys?
Right. We wouldn't. No, there's like a community reputation thing happening.
Policing each other in a way,
I wonder though, like, I don't know, I didn't play with very large groups. Daniel, you and I played with...
I played at 3
I don't know
max.
who it was, Chris, so I haven't played with very large groups though, but I didn't feel like it was a hard enough game to really threaten the run coming to a close. And also, aren't a lot of cooperative games about that cooperative survival or not? Like, Pandemic could quite readily come to a close just because a bunch of things kind of cascade the wrong way, right? And everyone sees the Jenga tower come tumbling down, and they're cool with it. They're not happy, but like that's a common outcome in a co-op game,
I think the difference, though, is that the roguelike aspects is the thing that, like, roguelike and cooperative side by side, where one is trying to achieve like unique optimal results and tweak it for, like, there's a push your luck aspect, and mixing that with cooperative is kind of it fights against it a little bit, because one is assuming risk and the other one is trying to reduce risk.
Okay, I see what you mean. It's sort of like, it's sort of loss aversion, right? Because unlike Pandemic, you don't really feel attached to those characters, but in this game, you've invested. You've invested in your build, you've invested in your deck, like you've spent time nurturing that to be your own.
Yeah, and you really want to achieve these unique results. And it's like, and I want to like point out something weird that I always think about whenever I play games like this, is like, I could always like go into a room by myself, lay out the game, and like make that perfect build by just putting the cards together, and that would feel so hollow, right? Like, it'd be so sad to like put together, this is the perfect build I imagine, and I'm not going to play the game. I'm just going to put these cards in a row and then smile to myself, right?
But like, sounds like you're making a magic deck.
Yeah. I mean, for all of the like the 10 different levels of randomization that are coming into this game, success is largely going to coming down to how well you can control that, and reducing as much of that chaos as possible, right? You want to get the most predictable deck as possible. You want to get the relics that are going to fire off most predictably. So you really are behooving to not be taking chances. Like you want to play it as safe, especially when it takes so much longer.
And the original game was all about like going, yeah, screw it. Let me go for it. Let me see what happens. I might get the thing I really want. What's
the thing? Like we were discussing, like in relation to Balatro and this rise in roguelites, where you inevitably hit this point where this run isn't going to be it. This it hasn't got the juice. New run. This isn't it. New run. And like I never want to be in that spot. I want to let each run like be its own, and the most interesting experiences in this game are often where it goes bad and where you don't have the perfect selection of cards and you're forced to improvise with a cool combo. And I think I appreciate that in the board game, that it lets you enjoy the run. It gives more space for every run to matter because you are invested in it, right?
Yeah, that is a nice part of it. Yeah. I mean, like that the difficulty, the trade-off is like making your deck less interesting, right? And like that's a kind of the issue is then you like, all right, so I have to play an entire new game. And it's going to be a 90-minute experience as opposed to like a 10-minute one. But the thing about it is the board game is I do think the game is better balanced by far.
Yeah.
And
not as punishing.
Yeah. And more importantly, like I think it's one of the great things about tabletop versions of these games is that the numbers don't just scroll past and your brain like glazes over and it isn't magic, right?
Well, you're forced to internalize every single card, and there's the space to think about the implications of that card because you're playing it through slowly and letting every card, every change to your deck breathe.
Yeah, and I mean, I went to an event called the Steam Up where I like would see Steam engines, and part of the appeal of that to me is, I could actually see it work.
You know, I was kind of struck by something you said there, Sean. Is how do we make these decks more interesting? I don't know how many times you guys have played. I've played this game about 4 or 5 times now, and I think it's starting to feel a bit repetitive. I don't know if it's worth all the struggle of applying all those status tokens here and there and adjusting them every round and this or that. That's just so much easier to do in the video game because the AI once again handles it for you. But I wonder if I could have really an interesting deck if I got to combine cards from the different characters more and create kind of a mixture. Then the strategies would really open up more widely. I mean, I could see how maybe at the end of every encounter, you just give your deck to, your pool of potential cards, I should say, to your neighbor. And be like, you draft 3 cards over there.
Yeah. I actually think that would be an awesome idea.
That would hold my interest, especially if you got tired of the, basically the strategies that are available to you.
And theoretically, like, you can do it in the sense that I actually think something in there, if it is the video game had some of these scenarios, like you have a silent with a single electric light over their head, like from the defense, like you have one orb, but you never get to like get them to go. And because it's so rare to have those things touch, right?
Yeah, there are some options. I think, in the video game, you can make a custom build where you get to toggle on or off all of the switches and get a high degree of control. But theoretically, if you wanted to try your, game developer's hat, you could just take the components of the analog game and really remix them in a truly interesting way or a much more deviously hard way, because you can literally get in the works and adjust everything to a high degree of control.
Yeah, there's like a daily run CRT table where you roll a die and then it has checkboxes where it like says just roll a die a couple times and then add these variables to it, which is largely I think how the video game did it eventually anyway. It's just RNG all these conditions. So like to add a colorless card to every deck, or like only I forget what they are, but yeah, I mean it's what really felt weird is the unlocks. Like those felt almost goofy. It's like,
so I like the progression there. It feels like you achieved something, right? You have something to show for it.
Yeah. Yeah,
When do you open those packs? I mean, I saw them, but I didn't open them because they're your copy of the game. But
it's
when
like
do you open them?
it's like when you finish a round, you get like basically a tick mark for every boss you beat +1, and then once you hit these certain thresholds, you get to unlock packs. It's a little fiddly. Like there is an app I think you can use to track those tick marks, or you can just do it in the book. It's not as elegant as having this the game do it for you automatically. You have to like dig through the different organizers. What I will say, excellent box. Like the organizer in the game is very good for organizing the cards and the sheer number of components in the game.
Yeah, it's always nice when they like, and this one really needs it, especially with like so for the minions, do they actually like let you separate them by type? Like these are where the goblin minions for Act 1 go.
No, there's separators for like each act. Like there's the Act 1 summons, here's the Act 2 summons. And like Act 2, sometimes you'll come across an enemy that needs summons from Act 1 and you don't really have to go digging back through it again. Yeah. It is very fiddly, yeah.
Yeah, I will say it's like it seems like a fiddly game. Like when I was playing it, we played the sort of tabletop simulator mod because we couldn't find a copy in the area, but so like it handled a lot of that stuff for us, but we were thinking we had to drag out the minions every single time and like separate them out and flip through them. I don't know, man. I'm torn, but I do think that like there is an audience for this game, and I do think actually it made a few improvements that if someone really likes Slay the Spire, if they wanted to get people, well, my best friend had one theory, as he said, people who really know Slay the Spire inside and out, and they play the game in order to get the wackiest combos together that they possibly could, like, and they just kind of prop each other up. I thought this would be great if I have people who don't play Slay the Spire, who don't like, it's like the Tanuki suit, right, in Mario, where they don't want to bear the burden of like having a perfectly constructed, optimized deck to have fun. Right?
Yeah. Do we want to start getting into closing thought? Is there any other final big picture topics you want to hit?
I kind of want to like avoid the thing of like viewing this as comparing it always to the video game, but I do think that the main thing of recontextualizing it, the thing I said before of like pushing your luck being what the cards and the design are telling you to do, and being risk averse is what the co-op part is trying to do. That to me is kind of where I feel like the designers didn't really think through how simply moving a game to a multi-person experience would affect how it's viewed.
It is an incredibly faithful adaptation. It added co-op, but didn't really change the core structure otherwise. Other than there's some number crunching, there's some rebalancing, but the core structure is still exactly the same.
And that like that thing of being perceived affecting a game, I wish more designers would consider. Like putting, we found that like putting eyeballs on a fountain, like above a fountain, changes the way people behave. Like, so even the thought of being seen while doing something makes us behave differently. And I feel when making these adaptations, they almost never consider that.
Yeah, for me, part of me, I'll just come out and say that I enjoyed the times that I played this game, but I don't think I'm going to ask to play it in the future. I think the experience feels more natural to me and more streamlined and seamless in the digital version. I mean, that is where it came from, the original design. So it feels more natural there. And to me, this game sort of acts as an interesting artifact in its own case, as a sort of an experiment that's designed more for the fans of the video game. Right? It's almost like an elaborate collector's item.
Yeah.
For the fans of the video game that might also be into tabletop games, because I think there are much more interesting tabletop games that are dedicated deck builders. You mentioned Aeon's and the game that I played a lot myself, that has so many unique things that it does that doesn't just copy Slay the Spire or does things beyond what any other deck builder has done. And that game is still excellent. There's many iterations of it. The bosses are super cool and unique, and the game is easy to manage without a bunch of fiddly tokens. I think it succeeds where a lot of tabletop games fail, and this game, Slay the Spire, the board game, kind of seems like less pleasing for a pure tabletop fan, and it's probably too complicated to a board game novice who is a Slay the Spire fan. So I think it's going to have a narrow focus, and then for me, it misses.
Something is a little lost in translation from going from like the original analog inspiration to digital to analog again, and rather than just a game that was designed to be on the table from the get-go, right? But I wanted to bring this back to what we discussed at the very beginning in terms of addictive games. And it does feel like every game these days is designed to be a forever game, whether it's intended that way or not, or whether it's the players demanding that there be more of an end game, right? Every game now has to be just playable forever with endless runs and endless ascensions or whatever it may be. That dopamine hit of roguelites, I'm really starting to get disillusioned with. But I still really struggle with that roguelite generation of hit the RNG level one more time. Is this the run? Is this the run? Is this the run? No. Like I have my own sickness, like in terms of wanting to play lots of different games. Not to say that that's morally superior in any way. Like people who want to sink all their time into one game, nothing wrong with that at all. Personally, I would rather have a more intimate experience with a few games, and I think this board game does bring Slay the Spire back down to that level. It's not just about tactility, but also an intimacy with the mechanics, with your deck, and just internalizing the systems a little more. And like I don't want to be playing Slay the Spire forever to get those Ascension runs anymore. I'm just burnt out. I don't have time for that. But if I need a hit, I just want a run of Slay the Spire. I can go to the board game and have that one run be more meaningful than in the digital version.
Well, I'm gonna put a hot take. Not the hottest take. Like, it's not gonna scorch you.
Lukewarm.
I think Slay the Spire is not that well designed with deck builder. Like, the original video game, I think, has all of these flaws and more. Like, we were talking about like the dead turns, where it's like, all right, okay, and now I have to go through all the procedure, right, with none of the meat, all garnish, no meat, right? Like with this thing of like, I calculate out the math and I can skip 2 turns, right, and just skip to the end. In the board game, at least you can skip to the end. In the video game, you have no choice. Right? You have to like surrender to the math.
There's no undo button.
Yeah, exactly. And there's no ad hoc ergo propter hoc, right? Like sort of thing. You can't make a certain series of assumptions and then skip ahead. I think that like this was a lot of people's virgin experience with deck building, period. Right. For a lot of them who entered through video games, I think that this was their dominion, right? But the thing that makes like deck builders for me great on the table is there's an economy aspect to it. Like every decision can't really be skipped. There are always at least interesting ones. Even when you run dry or have a bad hand, there's a sense of, oh, because it's an economy game and not a power leveling game as in Slay the Spire, I have to tweak the consistency. In Slay the Spire, consistency is a little bit less of a consideration because you remove very few cards, right? Adding cards is almost always the best option. And the consistency itself is not nearly as important. So in the same way that a race is like measuring your body against the task, like Dominion or Thunderstone, like you're measuring the economy of your deck against this sort of motor, like the engine aspect.
Well, against other players is the crucial thing, which is always a moving target, right?
Yeah, exactly. And in Slay the Spire, though, it's all kind of measured against the combo, right? The individual turn combo. And you have one great turn, and then you have a lot of dead ones, right? That you just have to get through to get to that high turn where you play all your cards again, right? It's kind of like, it provides the same high that villages did in the original Dominion, like village, that right. People eventually realized was like maybe impressive on the table, but not impressive in terms of like actually making a good.
The 30 card turn, right?
Yeah.
Someone was always so pleased with themselves when they did the 30 card turn.
Yeah, and Slay the Spire wants those 30 card turns, but when I draw a bum hand and Slay the Spire, there's not really a whole lot I can do to correct that, because it's not an economy game. It's a It's a power leveling game, right? It's munchkining, right? So in that sense, I feel like that takes away from the tabletop experience of that moving target that you mentioned, right? Looking at the other players and measuring myself against them in a race, right? So for me too, this feels like Slay the Spire is a decent board game. I actually, if they made the board game digital, I'd actually like the digital version better because of that less of that JRPG stuff.
It goes back.
Yeah, but
It inverts again.
To me, though, like all the issues with co-op and roguelike, they aren't compatible, like in this version. And I feel like that tension runs through the whole game, right?
Yeah, I only played co-op a couple of times. I didn't expect myself to enjoy this solo. I thought it would be too tedious moving all the pieces around, but treating it more as a ritual and just slowing it down and enjoying making every run matter. I just found as enjoyable experience. If I'm going to just play a round every couple of months, I'd rather it be the board game. I think. As I said, if you're a super fan of Slay the Spire, you'll probably know like it'll probably be too slow for you. Like you just want to play the cards, get them out there. You'll know if co-op is enough of an appeal to you specifically. If you want to see how those bounce off of each other. I don't think it's a great intro experience. I think the rules aren't particularly good at sort of onboarding new players. But if you're somewhere in between, like me, and just if you're a filthy casual, I just want to run every now and then, I think it's a good facsimile.
Yeah,
it's a pretty coffee table book of a game for Slay the Spire fans.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, great talk. I really enjoyed that conversation, Sean.
Yeah. And I had a great time. Yeah.
Awesome.
It's interesting. This one was like mixed for all of us, it feels. Like it feels like a little bit like for all of us we're like, I didn't waste my time.
It's got its pros, it's got its cons, and hey, it all comes down to personal preference in the end. So like why are we having this discussion?
I guess, but we're also talking about the deck building genre where there's this strange Ouroboros of like the deck builder eating like the video game, going back to the deck build to the analog, right? Yeah. Strange snake eating its own tail thing.
And games are complex things. They're not just all good, not just all bad. Like we take the good with the bad, and adaptations are even harder to accomplish.
And I like more faithful adaptations as a rule. Like I don't want to play. I got at one point like Hawken the board game, which was a weird like little trick taking game with a side thing for heat. And I'm like, this is not like when I said I want a Hawken board game, I want the I don't just want a trick-taking game with like a picture of a mech.
Well, so we covered Age of Wonders Planetfall last year, which was basically 7 Wonders drafting game. And like with video games being so complicated, normally you have to abstract a large degree of it. But Slay the Spire is already so abstracted that I thought it was a fascinating case study in how you adapt a game.
Yeah, I could go both ways. It's sort of impressive just as an exercise to see how faithful you can make a game in converting it from digital to analog. But, I also like games that, play with the overall themes and abstract them a bit more. I played a game conversion adaptation of Stardew Valley with my kid recently because they really like the video game. And it plays kind of nothing like the video game, but how would you convert that into a board game, right? They had to abstract. So
how do you make Witcher 3 a board game or Skyrim, right? Like you can't. You have to just condense the experience into a tighter package, obviously.
I mean, yes, but at the same time, like I also have like Portal. I thought Bloodborne, the board game, was actually a pretty good adaptation in the sense of like that visceral tight combat and that feeling of spatial awareness. Having like a werewolf throw your partner down a flight of stairs and like crashes into it, bleeds out, like feels like very much a Bloodborne moment, right? And it managed to convert that really well. And I think Frostpunk did a good job too, and I think Heroes 3 actually did a really good job. But it used to be, I thought, that board gamers were all like, well, we don't want to have a shooter in the form of a board game, so we're going to try and like say, I have one, Siege of Columbia, was like from BioShock Infinite.
Oh yeah, I never played that. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's a risk game for two players, and it's a fun risk game for two players. But the whole idea is that the two factions are seen from above, right? But you're kind of left going like, is this really what I signed up for? Right? Like, I like the video game and I want to get the same
But it
feeling.
has the characters that you love.
Yeah, exactly, right? It's like, but they're there. And look, there's 3 timelines, one for each of Elizabeth. But
yeah, at the same point, there's also video game spin-offs of video games, right? That do mix up the gameplay. Like there's the Witcher, there's
Gwent.
the Witcher card game, Gwent, which they converted into its own game, which is like an adventure game with a narrative. So they do things. They do things even within video games that are variations upon itself.
The Gwent in the Witcher 3 was totally broken, and the Gwent
does not hold up to its own game. Yeah.
Well, it's you busted. I played the same combo every time, and it's like I'm the champion of the world, right? And it's like immediately, it wasn't really made to hold up to serious scrutiny. Gwent, the Thronebreaker actually was pretty competitive. Like I could say, this would be like an actual deck building game.
Have the dice game from Assassin's Creed Valhalla around here. Like the physical version.
What is it, Logar or something like that?
Orlok, I think it's called.
Orlok.
Yeah.
It sounds bizarre.
Got to get me a deck of Sabak there.
I have one of those.
Sabak! I haven't thought of Sabak in years.
There's no end to the games within games.
The -7 cards and like stuff like that. Yeah, that's really funny.
Should we bring this home? Sean, why don't you remind us of your new podcast?
Yeah, the podcast is Role Play, and it's about what we teach the player, not about the mechanisms. So in D&D, for instance, like we talked in here about the pit in the ground. In this case, like Slay the Spire, right? The reason why it was originally called Dungeons and Dragons is like a puzzle approach to game masters versus the players, where you present them a puzzle in like completely flat open space
and kill them with a pile of falling rocks.
Well, you need, but you need no world for a hole in the ground, right? Like you don't need to like, why is the hole ground here? Why is there a basilisk in it? How did the basilisk get here? Did they breed them down here? Like, why is there a store on the 4th floor? There's a store on the 4th floor in like Slay the Spire too. You don't have to explain any context, and like so for the way that D&D used to be set up. That's the way it sort of trained its players, is to view this as an adversarial. I present you puzzles and you try and solve them, right? And then we get into the modern day where dungeons are rarely seen ever, right? Like people go, why is it called Dungeons and Dragons? I haven't seen a dragon and I've never seen a dungeon.
I saw a dragon on the horizon once.
Yeah, they showed up, burned the town, and left. And I've been playing D&D for 5 years and I've never been in a dungeon, right? Like, so there are a lot of people coming up with that. And it's because this mode shifted. And like, so we talk about the history of like how the gamers were taught differently, right? Over time, as like the psychology of play changed. So we talk about stuff like that, right?
Cool.
Less over like, where's this from? And more over, why do people do it this way? And why is it, how do people think when they play, right?
Look forward to listening to that myself. I'll drop the link to that in the show notes. Is there anywhere else where you can find you online?
Yeah, you can find me at weeksauthor.com. That has a lot of free articles from stuff where I published it. The ones that are paywalled are because Altman is on the hunt, and I want to at least put up a padlock to like say, hey, this isn't yours. It's not free. Because there are a lot of people who say like no paywall means I can take it, right? Like
yeah.
So,
they'll find their way through there sooner or later, whether you give permission or not. I did really enjoy your interview with Cole last year as well, so I'll drop the link to that as well.
Oh yeah, that would be great.
So thank you for joining us, Sean. You can find us at omnigamersclub@gmail.com if you have any thoughts or questions for the podcast. You can find me at BoardGameFeast at Bluesky, no longer on Instagram. I am out of here.
Oh, good job. Good job. Good for you.
Same here as well. I've cut Facebook and Instagram out of my life, so you can catch me as OmniGamerMark on Bluesky. And do catch our videos on YouTube. We post them every time an audio episode comes out, so you can catch us there, leave some comments, share the podcast and YouTube channel with a friend who might be interested in these sorts of things. And Daniel, you want to tell us what game we're going to be talking about next time?
Yeah, so we're jumping back to the digital side of things. We are going to be playing Pentiments, the video game from Obsidian, the sort of RPG, the medieval scroll murder mystery. A lot going on there.
Yeah, here's a fan of the classics right here, right, Sean?
Oh
Yeah,
yeah!
like
Oh
it's
my!
excitement.
Oh my God! I loved it so much. I have actually like an editor who, after they played it, went and like became an works with the Anglican Church now, and I actually think the game was no small part in like having her leave Paste Magazine. Like,
wow,
it is one of those games that makes you go like, maybe I should be a monk.
Impactful game.
You're going to have to share some notes with us before that episode records.
A lot of historical attention to detail for those history fans there. So, yeah, looking forward to digging into that.
The medial S.
So cool. Thank you so much again, Sean, for joining us. It was a great talk, and you got a lot to share with us. So, so very cool to tease your brain about that.
Oh, yeah, my pleasure. Yeah. Al, glad to be back anytime, guys, and I hope to have you guys on Roll Play at some point.
Certainly.
Sounds great.
All right. Bye for now.
I'll check out the podcast.
Thanks.
Take care. Thanks a lot. And for those listening, until next time.
Right, you guys.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi.
Have a very balanced diet of gaming. Thanks a lot.
Bye.